The closing of E3 is going to have far deeper effects than anybody realizes, and it's going to cause massive effects throughout the whole gaming industry. But before we begin, please be sure to subscribe to the channel so I can keep bringing you gaming content, and leave a like if you enjoy the video. Gaming conventions have not been as popular in recent years as they have in the past, but there's still a fond nostalgia for them. That having been said, declining numbers and other events obviously started to paint the walls with the future, and now we finally have confirmation that at least one gaming convention, E3, is permanently gone. This is a very sad day for a lot of people who were very attached to this, but it's interesting to note that many who used to frequent it have had a mixed reaction to its departure, to say it best. That having been said, most people aren't really talking about the two effects that this closure seems to really indicate. And let's go ahead and do that. So, the first problem that this closure creates is not inherent to E3 alone, but rather the fact that most conventions are going away around the video game sphere. There is now a lack of interaction between game players and game developers. Now, this has been on and off for the last decade or so because as more companies have gone digital, that interface has been declining. But I still think that the feedback that people get at conventions is a valuable tool. It can't be spammed the same way that a digital interaction can, and there's nothing quite like, I think, game observers watching people actually test the games. Whether the elation they feel at trying something new, or genuine frustration at glitches and bugs. But I think that over the course of the last few years, we have really seen that a lot of larger game developers don't genuinely seem to care that much about what their players actually think. And I think that that's been really obvious with the way that we've seen them continually go into live service games, which have been increasingly unpopular. We saw that with things like the disastrous Diablo mobile release. The fact that that was at a convention and had such a severe reaction. And to be honest, I think ditching conventions is somewhat due to that. I don't think developers necessarily want to have to deal with the fact that players are unhappy with their products, because most players are correct to be unhappy. We're not talking about people who are just unhappy with certain graphics or unhappy with a certain direction a game took. We're talking about people who are voicing concerns over how much time and resources are being dedicated to fairly simple concepts. We're talking about people talking about how offensive it is that a gaming company is going to want them to pay up more money, and they're going to tell them that, and they don't want to be told that. So that lack of interaction, I think, is going to further increase our issues in the gaming industry in terms of how those developers interact with people. But it's not the only issue. Arguably, the industry's second largest problem comes from the community. Now, I think the gaming community still has a lot of merit. We've seen certainly a large shift over even just looking back over 20 years, but there's still a fierce community there. People celebrate games together, they want to interact with each other. I still see people all the time talking about trying to bring back co-op games. And I think that sense of unity, not competition, is an important aspect. Don't get me wrong, I mean, I think people love playing Mario Kart and racing games and fighting games, but that's a different type of competition to the insular, detached style of competition that we've seen to emerge over the last 10 years. Gaming companies want to switch to multiplayer because it requires everyone to have their own copy of the game. It also requires them to have their own console. But it also creates an issue where people aren't interacting as closely as they used to. And that's too bad because video games used to bring people together all the time. The image can be hard to find, but if you can try and Google LAN party where a player is taped to the ceiling, that's how desperate people were to all game together. That a guy would let himself be taped to the ceiling in his college dorm because he wanted to be able to play with his friends. I'm not saying that's good advice, I'm just saying that games used to form that sense of community. And certainly we have had games, in the last few years that do encourage that style of play. It's just becoming more and more uncommon within the mainstream. And so I think that shutting down conventions is just going to affect that even worse. No longer are players going to be able to get together from around the country, even around the world, to go and see these new games because that's just not an option. Maybe they'll interact in chats and digital, but that's not the same thing. And yes, many gamers, myself included, don't really like to go out in public scenes. That's just a natural part of us. But there's something to be said for the fact that when you're all introverts, you're pretty aware of each other's space a lot of the time, which makes it more comfortable. So I think that that loss of community is going to have to be replaced. It'll be replaced by somebody, but it's going to have to be replaced. And I'm looking forward to see what happens there, because until we address these two issues that eFree's closure really brings into contrast, the gaming industry is going to suffer a lot. That having been said, I do see people still probably picking up to go to things like, the PAX gaming conventions, especially because that's more centered around indie development. And I think indie development will probably be a continued spotlight on this channel, but also just on gaming in the future, because with the emergence of more technology and greater attention to detail, indie games are quickly replacing mainstream titles as a favorite among many players. So why not have an indie convention replace mainstream conventions? But why don't you let me know what you think the issues of E3 closing, and if you're sad and have any fond memories, in the comments. All right.